Bobby Donnan with SAFE, Daniel Gage with NGV America, and we should be having Michael McAdams with the Advanced Biofuels Association join us, but some of our technical challenges earlier this afternoon may be keeping them from joining. We will be taking some questions from the audience. If you guys want to submit them, we'll try to work them in as we engage in this discussion. To get us all started, I'm first going to turn to Dave Banks. Dave, given the role in the Select Committee in Congress, we're wondering if you can set the broader policy context as it relates to reducing emissions from the transportation sector. Maybe some of the factors that policymakers are considering, what Republicans are considering, and maybe some of the options that folks on the other side of the aisle are looking at, particularly as the Senate perhaps changes hands and as we go into a new Democrat administration in the White House.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. It's great to be here today. I really appreciate the opportunity. Sorry that I can't join the webinar for whatever reason. I've got some internet issues. But look, I mean, to build on some of what Todd said, and this is really important, by the way, to look at the numbers, because so much of our conversation as it pertains to climate policy and mitigation strategies in general ignore the facts on the ground as it pertains to the global situation. And so, if you look at transportation, again, I think Todd may have said this, it accounts for about 30% of U.S. GHG emissions. But in terms of global GHG emissions, it's about half that. And I think it's important to sort of recognize, the gap and why so. I mean, look, I guess this is pretty obvious. I'll still say it anyway. But look, the gap between the United States and where things are globally is due to the high penetration of cars and trucks here in the States, and of course in richer economies in general, right? But again, this is really important to recognize because we have to be really aware of where transportation emissions are going to be coming from as far as the growth, over the coming decades globally, and that I think that helps inform what type of strategy and approach that we can pursue in addressing transportation emissions. Putting COVID aside, when we're looking at global demand for liquid fuels, we're still looking at a significant increase by 2050 compared to 2010. So if you're looking at transportation GHG policies that only focus on the United States and rich countries, they've got their limits. We've got to keep our eye on the ball. We have to, and we do not do this, by the way, which is challenging. We need to look at a commercialization pathway for low carbon transport that also works for developing economies. Look, this expected growth and demand for cars in the developing world is a real challenge. While poor economies with large populations, they made a lot of progress in expanding electricity access. Oh, hold on.
Being evacuated, Dave?
Maybe. Hold on. It's the Capitol. Okay. Yeah. They're having to evacuate the Capitol. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Things are crazy.
You have time to finish your point, or if not, we can pivot.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Let me kind of work through this. My apologies. Yeah, I mean, again, look, I mean, when we're talking about poor economies, the fact that motor vehicle penetration remains remarkably low compared to the United States and other rich countries, and sort of in contrast, if you look at the progress that they made in expanding electricity access, for example, there's more than 1.3 billion cars and trucks in the world compared to 670 million in 1996. So huge growth. China leads the world with over 300 million compared to, I think, around 270 million for the United States. Uh, and by the way, when you're looking at transport emissions, they're very, very hard to abate compared to other sectors. Moving folks and products at reasonable speed requires fuels that are energy dense. Gasoline, for example, has about 500 times of the energy density of a lead acid battery. Consumers, on top of this, consumers are willing to pay high premiums for fuel. So policies that increase fossil fuel prices don't do that much to reduce demand. And at least in the foreseeable future, the price of those conventional fuels is expected to remain relatively low. Now, back to the developing world, most of them don't tax fuel, or they do so at a really low rate, and a lot of them subsidize it. Cars aren't cheap, so folks there, they want to, and here too, right? They want to maximize their lifespan. So even if you have alternative fuel vehicles, and if they're widely available, it's going to take decades to turn over the existing fleets. Advocates of pushing these sort of dramatic policy shifts within transportation within really short timeframes, in my opinion, just aren't realistic. Okay, they're unrealistic, especially when they're talking about 10 years or so. But look, most major transportation initiatives that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they've got their roots in energy security policy. So, for example, CAFE, the RFS, Europe's fuel taxes, even China's EV program. The energy security policy typically seeks, and by the way, I mean, you guys know this, but seeks to minimize the oil imports by promoting efficiency, alternative fuels, and technologies that don't rely on petroleum. And so generally, economies that are poor in oil resources are willing to pay a greater premium for energy security, along with paying some for air pollution as well. But support for the level of that premium really tracks with the perceived vulnerability. So I know there's a lot of conversation about China, for example, and the strides that they're making with EVs, but this is in large part to reduce their vulnerabilities when it comes to crude imports. It's a largely an energy security and sort of air pollution abatement strategy. It's worth reminding folks that the United States, here we already pay a large energy security premium through policies, such as CAFE and RFS. Despite the fact that the United States, we're in a totally different place today, thanks to the shale revolution. But on the other hand, when we're talking about oil resources and climate mitigation in the transport sector, look, I mean, countries with a lot of oil and that wish to preserve the value of those resources in a carbon-constrained world, they have an incentive to invest in technologies, in programs that reduce emissions from that fossil fuel use. As we know, as all of us know, the United States has fossil fuel energy resources worth trillions of dollars. And as a result, look, America has a strong economic and national security incentive to protect its assets by producing the most efficient and lowest emission barrel of oil in the world. Now, keep in mind that the emissions from fossil fuel use are the problem. It's not the fossil fuels per se. So if we adequately address those emissions, use of those fuels would be consistent with a climate-friendly scenario. Also, I think there's a myth that we have to keep all fossil fuels in the ground to avoid dangerous temperature increases. That's just not true. The IPC doesn't say that. The science would suggest that we should keep a certain percentage of global fossil fuels in the ground without further technology innovation. So in some of the numbers that I've seen, you keep 80% of the coal, 50% of the gas, a third of the crude in the ground. But on its flip side, that means that 20% of coal, half the gas, and 2/3 of the crude can be used in the business as usual scenario that is safer for the climate. But as we accelerate these low carbon technology breakthroughs in transport, we need to strive to make sure that only the most efficient of those fossil fuels from a GHG perspective are used. But again, when we're looking at different strategies for transportation abatement, richer economies with dense populations are likely to adopt electrification more widely. And policymakers should recognize that low-income countries, particularly the ones that lack the infrastructure, are not in a position to electrify their transportation sector. So while electrification can and I think should play a role, at least some role in poor economies. These developing economies also require access to conventional fuels that are cleaner. Clean innovation in the space would help ensure access to the affordable energy that they need to alleviate poverty and advance economic opportunity while reducing the associated emissions. And let me say just a little bit about EVs before I wrap up. I'm sorry, I'm kind of going a little long, but look, I mean, there's no question that they offer a significant opportunity to reduce emissions. But again, we've got some major challenges here. From a poor country perspective, costs remain a lot higher than conventional fuel vehicles. But even in the United States, there's a question of scalability, as growth in EV production is going to require significant inputs and minerals. Today, we're 100% reliant on imports for a number of these necessary minerals needed to produce EVs. Look, this poses a national security challenge for us. Significant EV or significant minerals used for EV batteries, and a lot of folks, don't talk enough about this, but we should. I mean, they're sourced overseas using, child labor. And at some point, this issue is going to have to be addressed. There's also charging infrastructure development challenges that we've got to work through. I mean, who's responsible for the capital investment? Who reaps the profits from more EV charging stations? We've looked at government or electricity or electric utilities building out the infrastructure. But, is that the best approach? And is it the best approach when you're looking at creating a competitive market? So overall, we don't have a firm grasp, of exactly how much global climate benefit we can achieve through transport electrification, given these constraints. But look, again, policies for reducing GHG-related transport emissions, we should focus on the global emissions impact and not just domestic reductions. Global strategy for transportation mitigation, rooted in convincing poor nations to adopt high-cost policies and technologies, that's not going to work. Accordingly, I think we're going to argue that U.S. strategy should focus on the innovation, research, development, and deployment, and recognize that we need to look at a number of policies and measures, right? Just through the production of lower carbon fuels that would work with existing vehicles and infrastructure, and not simply focused on electrification. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Todd. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dave. And Dave, if you need to run to evacuate the Capitol, that's fine. We all would understand that. I think
thanks a lot, guys.
Part of what you were saying there was focusing on kind of the unintended consequences of putting all of our eggs in one technology basket. And I think we want to hit that from a couple different angles today. But it seems to me what you were saying is that not only are we losing some opportunities for utilizing existing infrastructure and technologies we have here in the United States and our abundant fossil fuels, but pushing those technologies along in a way that we can export more efficient versions of, say, for example, internal combustion engine or other technologies, hydrogen, for example, to the developing world that they might be more readily willing to use. Is that what I was hearing? Okay, I guess we lost it. Okay.
I'm still here. That's absolutely right. It's gonna take lots of different technologies and innovation, kind of across the board to be able to address effectively transportation emissions globally. Right. Again, we got to get away from just looking at policies that work for the United States.
Makes sense. And so we've got folks here on the webinar today that are doing a lot of work in these different technology spaces. We've got Daniel with Natural Gas Vehicles for America, and I know you've done your companies are doing a great bit of work to reduce the environmental footprint of your technologies. Maybe you want to just tell us a little bit about what's going on with your sector and how it could help advantage the overall drive of emissions reductions here in the United States and perhaps globally as well.
Sure, thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to you all to have us on. I couldn't agree more with our first speaker. With any illness, there's more than one way to treat a patient, and I think we need to look at this challenge the same way. Every patient is different. And in transportation, every application is different. So, you know, a policy of forced electrification, whether we're looking at the global perspective or we're looking just here in the United States, it just won't work. Natural gas has been really, we were one of the first alternative fuel technologies developed over 30 years ago. We play in the light duty, medium, and heavy duty spaces. Obviously, primarily now the light duty guys are moving from ICE engines to electrification. But we are a long, long way off before that makes any type of sense, or even if it's possible from a heavy duty standpoint. So our members, most of our members are focused sort of on the heavy duty space. We've always been a very clean, efficient, effective, affordable technology for what I like to call the 3 T's: trash, trucks, and transit. So transit buses, refuse haulers, as well as freight haulers. And we're still seeing a lot of large fleets that are transitioning now that want to make that jump towards sustainability. They're transitioning through natural gas, and not just natural gas vehicles. The beauty of natural gas vehicles is that they can be fueled by conventional natural gas, or simply what's collected below ground, right, through fracking and other methods, but then also renewable natural gas. And if we're talking about capping or addressing some of those global greenhouse gas emissions, we have to configure and think about how we address naturally occurring methane that occurs above ground through decomposition and the like. And that methane is really the second biggest contributor to human-caused global warming. So by using and capturing that RNG and then using it to, say, displace maybe other fuels in a natural gas vehicle, you're really getting, you know, a twofer there. RNG projects will capture that methane, they redirect it away from the environment, and they repurpose it as a clean, green energy source. And the beauty of it is that the end user is not only getting a zero emission equivalent result when it comes to criteria pollutants like NOx and particulate matter, but they're also getting a carbon negative outcome. Renewable natural gas use in California, most natural gas motor fuel use in California today is renewable natural gas, the overwhelming majority, almost 90%. It has the lowest carbon intensity of any on-road vehicle fuel, and that includes fully renewable electric or solar. And California, through its low carbon fuel standard program, and I know we might touch on that later, but it has certified it as a carbon negative outcome. And that's today, right? Fleets that we work with, they want a solution that's available, scalable, affordable today. They need to drive a truck, not a science project. And so I couldn't agree more with the fact that we need to think of an all of the above approach. We need to treat each application specifically. I use this analogy, I think last, when we spoke, it will be a long way before cement trucks run on any type of electric powertrain. So we need to use what's available to us. We need to rely on the science and the data that's here, and we need to respond today if we're going to have an impact and use all of these technologies. And there's a whole bevy of them here represented.
Great points. And circling back to Dave's comments, natural gas, our natural gas is the cleanest in the world. And it's something also that's readily exportable to the developing world. So in terms of addressing this worldwide problem, environmental problem, it might be a better bet, at least for the United States. Michael, I'm glad that you're able to join us. Sorry you had some trouble getting in today. We were just talking with Daniel about the advances that the natural gas folks had been making in reducing emissions from their products. And I know that you guys, your members have been doing quite a bit of work in that area as well, that I think is another kind of untold story in this whole debate about transportation. So maybe if you could just give us a snapshot of the good work that your members are doing and how you can contribute to the solution to reducing transportation emissions here in the United States and globally.
Great. Well, I'm sorry to be a little late today. I had some glitches here, but I'm really delighted to be with my colleagues here today with all of you on the audience. There's such a tremendous opportunity to do good and deliver carbon reduction. And one of the wonderful things about doing it is all the different venues and opportunities that are exhibited here today, all these different groups. We all have more in common than we have disparate. We all need to work together collectively to deliver a set of options for our future. And I'm really proud of what my industry can bring to the table. Like the other folks who spoke before me, although some of the folks think all of the above is a bad phrase, all of the above is the approach most of my members believe in. And when you look at the transportation sector, the heavy duty sector is about 35% of the global CO2 emissions. So when you look at airplanes and heavy duty trucks, and you look at ocean going vessels and heavy duty engines, they're running on diesel for a reason. They need high torque, they need consistency, they need fuel efficiency. The diesel motor is 35% more efficient than the gasoline motor. And so my guys are already at a point where we're looking to double the existing production that we've seen in the RFS. Currently are about 2.5 billion gallons a year of biodiesel and renewable diesel. What you're going to see is an explosion of renewable diesel in the next couple of years, which are all drop-in fuels and require no infrastructure changes. There are other new modern technologies that are coming to the fore. You're going to see our industry over the next 15 to 20 years to be able to lay in fuels at a higher and higher percentage with a carbon reduction of a minimum of 50%. The irony here is that a lot of these folks are going to make hydrocarbon molecules out of renewable feedstocks. And so when you look at it on a circular carbon basis, you're going to wind up with a gasoline and a diesel and a jet fuel that could potentially be 50 or 60% renewable produced, and the hydrocarbon molecule will be identical to the one that used to come from a barrel of oil. But on a life cycle basis, it's going to be 60 or 80% better when looked at holistically. So I'm sorry to be late. I'm delighted to be with a panelist here. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with them. Thank you, Todd.
Those are great points. Thank you for joining us. Late is no problem. And again, similar to the natural gas industry, that this is a product that seems more readily available and easily exportable, again, to solve concerns relative to U.S. emissions and globally. Continuing on the unintended consequences theme, Robbie, I want to get you in here because your group has done kind of a hard look at batteries and electric vehicles and the implications of switching, and particularly the fact that China controls most of the mineral resources that are needed to build these batteries, which if we have a wholesale switchover, which is not anytime in the near future, by the way, but assuming a large-scale switch to battery-powered vehicles in the United States could put us in a position where we are beholden to a hostile country for something that's very critical to our economy and our way of life. And I know you've done a study on that, and I just wondered if you could give us some thoughts on that.
Okay, so I just want to reframe that to say not anti-electrification. I'm going to raise a hand and say pro-electrification here, but I'm going to raise another hand and say pro all the above here, and very much pro-electrification as well as many of these solutions you see here. So yes, what you say is very true about electrification, which just means that we need to be much smarter about how we handle the situation. When SAFE, which is not a trade association, started in 2004 to end oil use, or the sole use of one fuel source in transportation, which is traded on a global market that is much controlled by a cartel. We've seen that on the high price. We've seen that on the low price when we go begging to the Saudis and the Russians, et cetera. And so when we started, there was really no solutions. You could have a little bit more fuel economy, and maybe you could have some production. Thank God for shale, that really changed. But now really we have all these solutions here, including electrification and some of the solutions, and each sector is going to have its own solution. And I think one of the problems we've seen in transportation policy is that we're always shooting at each other. And then oil, which, on one hand, I think it's great and we're for production, but at the end of the day, it's that singular dependence on one fuel source that is the problem, and they're going to win every time you shoot at each other. because they've got the incumbents. They've birthed a great fuel with a lot of density, and then they're the incumbents who have all this free infrastructure and other goodies. And from a federal level, I think we have to stop shooting at each other and actually work together. And I'm confident in electrification's future, just as I'm confident in many of the other solutions for other sectors, that if we're fuel neutral, each will have its own thing. But the federal government can do one thing that no one else can, which is spend money, as we see, in order to advance the cause. Specifically to electrification. And Dave Banks said something really interesting about national security, and most of this policy has been national security in America and everywhere else, but in China as well. And when I think of national security, I think of the role of the auto industry, the truck industry. They were the arsenal of democracy in World War II. They are now the arsenal of health, as we've needed ventilators. And if we lose, these are global companies and global industries. Tesla is now worth this morning I thought $750 billion. General Motors is worth like 60, and Ford is worth 35 to 40. If we lose these industries, those workers and everything else, we are in big trouble from a national security perspective. So I actually think electrification is happening. It's going to happen in greater degree. And we, as we heard before, do not have the minerals, do not have the anodes, do not have the cathodes, do not have the battery cells happening in the United States. Out of 147 gigafactories happening, only 107 are in China, 9 are in the United States. 95% of rare earth minerals are being developed in China, or processed in China, not here. Now, the beauty is we have the capital markets, we have our own big market, and we also have all these minerals, in most cases, here. So it's not really a question of can we do it. The problem is, can we create the demand, both for this in the light duty sector and maybe some of the other sectors like delivery vehicles and others. Yes, it will compete with natural gas in some places, but can we create the demand that creates the supply chain? And I think if we fight about that for too much longer, there's no coming back because of what you see going on in the rest of the world. And I really think that what we need is a minerals to market strategy when it comes to electric vehicles as well. And as I said, it could be fuel neutral in that everyone here can, but that's really, to me, the most important thing. I make 2 other very quick points. One is, I do think it's important as we roll out environmental strategy to make sure we're thinking about the retooling of these industries at the same time. Because if we import one thing from Beijing, an electric vehicle, and lose a job in the Midwest, we've really not accomplished what we need. And that's not to slow it down. I think we can go fast. We just have to go fast, but at the same time, bring in the minerals, the processing, the battery industry at the same time. And I think that's what the Biden administration, who really is, I hope, I believe, is thinking about jobs and about the environment. That is really important when it comes to electrification, as part of this. And hopefully that Republicans can find something in the manufacturing, the minerals, and Democrats can find something in the deployment. So that to me is a quite an important piece of this whole equation. So to me, it could be all the above, but we should not continue to move aggressively in these supply chain issues in all of our sectors, because China is out there and they will win because they have a full country approach, because they have a national security need. And we can control the sea lanes, but they know that's not what they want. And if they're both off the national security threat of oil to our military, and they control the next set of industries, and what's so important to us in our industrial base, we've both cut our nose in spite of our face. So thank you for letting me say those comments, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Robbie. And yeah, just to be clear, I think that certainly we're on all of the above. That's the strategy that we're supporting here, and I appreciate your remarks relative to the industries that currently exist in the United States and the jobs that they are supporting, and what those folks are going to do if we have some sort of rapid wholesale switch, in addition to all the national security and other implications you were touching on. And I think that's a good segue to bring you, Richard, into the conversation. Your group has done a good bit of work looking at the economic and jobs implications of a very rapid switch toward electric vehicles in the agriculture sector, and how that has ripple effects throughout the broader economy. And I was wondering if you could maybe just give folks a snapshot of some of the findings that you guys have come up with.
Yeah, no, glad to do it and appreciate the opportunity to be here. Before I do that, I just want to maybe some of your participants may not be familiar with our organization or kind of who we represent.
Sure.
So we represent the ag retail sector or farm supply dealers that are working with growers, sell pesticide, fertilizer, seed products, and do custom application work. So a lot of these issues we're talking about, particularly like on the renewable fuel side, is very important to our industry. Not only as was mentioned at the beginning of the conversation about as a national security issue, it's an economic driver too for the ag economy and rural communities. Some of the things that were proposed this last Congress related to the ban on the internal combustion engine. Even in California, you look at the same thing. And I think you mentioned the beginning of this discussion on Massachusetts, for example. And I don't think that the politicians looking at this are really looking at the broader impact. So we wanted to do a study to try to look at not only the economic impact for the industry, for jobs and the like, but the impact on our particular industry. So we did a 3-scenario study. One was a base case of the electric vehicle market penetration increasing normally, just naturally, as just not having a skewed policies. And we saw that would increase by 13% of light duty vehicles by 2050. We had another scenario where there was an internal combustion engine ban by 2050. And the third scenario was, which has been proposed by some, by 2035, which is not that far around the corner if you really think about it. Under those scenarios, what we saw is, for at least the ag sector, we saw that the vehicle consumption of ethanol and biodiesel could decline by up to 90% to 1.1 billion gallons and up to 61% or 0.8 billion gallons respectively. We saw that corn and soybean prices or consumption would decrease by 2 billion bushels, and then soybeans 470 million bushels. On the pricing, which dropped too, that adversely impacts our farmers, our members, farmers, customers. U.S. net farm income would decrease by 27 billion. And then we saw job losses in the U.S. could reach up to 255,000 by 2050. Also a big impact on the GDP decline. So on the economic front is why we got engaged on this issue. We support all the above energy policy as well. For fertilizer manufacturing, when you saw high natural gas prices about in the early 2000s, a lot of the manufacturing plants producing domestic fertilizer production shut down. So we had to rely on imports. Now that it's lower, the production has been able to increase domestically here, for example. That just shows you how important natural gas is, not only to manufacturing of products like fertilizer for ag production, but for vehicles as well. We support expansion of like E15. We think that can be done to help have lower carbon emission vehicles, but not adversely impact, the performance of the vehicles as well, working with the auto manufacturers. The Trump administration, the EPA, the E15, for example, had been seasonal allowed, and now they propose having it year round, which we support. E85 expansion we support as well. It's in there's located the plant fueling stations for these are flex fuel vehicles in 42 states, including in Northern Virginia. You can find it. What's surprising is you can find it here, but a state like Nebraska, where they have fairly significant ethanol production, I couldn't find a flex fuel vehicle pump in that state. So there is efforts underway to try to expand it. We want to make sure that whatever solution it is, again, it doesn't make us dependent on other countries like China on the electric side. For example, we've had this trade war with related to pesticides, and some of the pesticide products, 100% of the active ingredients were coming from China, had to be imported. We're relying on them for those types of to manufacture products in the United States for ag production, and that's a concern to us. So for us, it's not only an economic issue, it is a national security issue related to a lot of these topics.
Thanks, Richard. I appreciate that. We've kind of been dancing around policy solutions a little bit, so maybe just kind of dive into that. The vehicle transportation industry is already fairly heavily regulated. I mean, you've got EPA and NHTSA standards, CAFE, and on down the line, and then you have individual states that can can sometimes be more aggressive than what is adopted here nationally. You know, what is the role for regulations moving forward? You know, the government has carrots and it has sticks. And, you know, right now we're at a place where we're trying to weigh what the best policy is to move forward on, you know, driving emissions reductions. You know, some folks now are choosing to pick a technology and to run with it. Others are supporting markets. You know, is there a happy medium, or what are your thoughts? And I'm opening this up to the group because I want to get kind of some sense as to what you each individually kind of feel, you know, the best policy options are, you know, moving forward. What are you going to be taking to the 117th Congress or to the Biden administration, you know, when they circle around and say, now it's time to move on the vehicles front?
I'm happy to take a crack at that. Let me just start by saying, it usually takes 10 years to do an energy bill. That's the historic time period. I would encourage people to kind of slow down and really be thoughtful about what the goal is here. For my organization and the members that I represent, many of whom are from the oil industry, who have made, I have 4 of them that have made pledges to try to hit net zero by 2050. Many of my friends in the environmental community, you know, want to demonize them, but, you know, they've been around for 100 years. They got plenty of financial backing, and they understand the liquid transportation fuels game better than anybody. You might want to think about that before you demonize them. So this one size fits all solution of federal mandates from Washington might not be the best idea. Free markets innovate pretty well, and I have part of my association that delivers more than 25% of all the diesel sold in the United States. They know how to get the fuel to the guys that need the fuel and keep the country warm and move the freight for Amazon all around the country. So that I would suggest that, you know, in all of the above approach with all of us represented here on the phone today, that we'll all have different needs. Some will need infrastructure. Some will need to buy down the cost of retooling refineries or changing the refineries so that they go from oil-based refineries to renewable-based refineries. And so a one-size-fits-all approach by saying, okay, well, the answer's in LCFS or the answer's in RFS. You know, there have been a lot of glitches in a lot of policies for a lot of years. Maybe we want to just take our time and be thoughtful about how we move the ball. And the ball is about carbon reduction. It's about affordable carbon reduction as expeditiously as possible that balances economic vitality of the country, jobs creation in the country, and oh, by the way, so we can all afford to run our vehicles, heat our homes, and turn our lights on at an affordable rate as well. So that would be my observation about where we need to start in terms of don't follow necessarily the alphabet soup of the RFS and the LCFS and all this other stuff on the transportation fuel side. Let's look at what we need to deliver and what we need to have for expedited carbon reduction. And then let's build a multiple phase policy at the public and private level to deliver that as expeditiously and thoughtful as possible.
So I'll go next. So, you know, I just saw a lousy movie that took place in Washington called Wonder Woman 84 or whatever the hell that thing's called. And like, it feels like we should not go back to the future. And really, we are at a different time. And when we started in 04, you know, all these technologies were not there, and we are here now. And I think it's really important. And in some ways, I don't think the regulatory side is the biggest, most important thing. You know, the rest of the world is regulated. And as I said before, these are global industries. You know, Cummins Engines, Ford Motor Company, General Motors, they're thinking about the rest of the world. California, you know, whatever, like legal things aside, you know, Massachusetts, like you've said it. So that's all happening. So I don't think wasting our time in some ways of putting more thumbs on scales really matters. I think it's really about helping our industries overcome into the next future, because their competitor is China. Their competitor is a whole country approach that can subsidize their industries ad infinitum, mostly because we've given them all the money in our debt. So let's give them a little more money maybe in our debt, and then spend the money to actually, you know, compete with them overall. Now, that's not to say we should get rid of the free market at all. That's just to say, like, there's massive amount of retooling. So from a regulatory perspective, it's allow innovation to happen, allow the minerals to be mined, allow the factories to be built, help the factories retool themselves, and then put money in the hands of businesses and consumers in some cases to buy slightly more expensive technology right now. But let's not think that these things aren't going to get better over time, each of these technologies. And then the last thing I'd say, and so we have a bill, as I said, minerals to markets. It does include some biofuels and other things, but ultimately it is a whole approach thinking through that. And then the other thing too, on just the regulatory side, I'd say is, I don't think just going into like, let's just reverse everything Trump did is the way to go. Let's think about the future. So if the future is really electric, well, then let's think about fuel economy not being the thing we need to force these companies to spend as much money on. They should be spending money on the future there, if that is the case. So I say that from someone who, if you just impose costs everywhere, it ultimately becomes impossible. And then finally, there's the connected, autonomous, shared future that we also have. And these technologies will play an impact, and they've never been really seriously looked at and how they feed into environmental and fuel policy. But if you bring some of this safety, some of this shared technology, some of these solutions will be natural for the companies that run the shared companies because you bring down the cost and everything else. So I think in many ways in the vehicle space, get out of the way, ensure safety. And once you have safety, let the companies innovate with the fuels they want and with the form factors and the way the vehicles look and what they can do. So I really preach an approach of more liberalism on the regulatory side, more money on the retooling side and on the demand side.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Daniel, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Robbie just mentioned. He stole my analogy with the thumb on the scale, or my idea with thumb on the scale. Government does mandate in order to influence innovation, and so I think that's really important for our folks. They just want a chance to compete, and they want parity. And so, separate from mandates, there are a lot of things. Robbie mentioned cafe. There are a lot of compliance issues in that, where the government has a thumb on its scale towards electrification. The Obama administration's encouraging that, and where we are today, at least in the light duty space. And that's all well and good, but as policymakers look forward, especially in this COVID world, they have to consider cost, they have to consider timeliness, and they have to make the most of these limited public resources to get the biggest, most cost-effective return on that investment. And I think all of us here on the panel today offer an opportunity and offer a solution. We just did a study. We've done several in this COVID world and unable to travel. We've been doing a lot of research. We just did a study where we looked at public sector investments in Texas and California from 2005 to 2019. These are public sector investments focusing on clean air, but also climate change. Texas, over that 14-year time period, spent 31% less money, but achieved 75% more in emissions reduction. So they had 75% more harmful NOx emissions reduced than California over about that same time period. And that's because Texas took an approach that was, let's invest in everything. Let's invest in clean diesel technology and biofuels. Let's invest in natural gas. Let's invest in electric. They didn't focus at all on a forced electrification strategy. And that's what a state like California has done over the last 4 or 5 years. And the problem is it's costly. These are development projects, which are good and all well and good, but it's not having impact in the frontline communities. It's not having an impact in a global standpoint that it needs to do. Since 2000, during that time, all the investment, Texas's population has gone up somewhere of 35%, and yet its overall NOx in the state has been reduced by almost 70%. California has spent all that money from 2006 to 2013. Their NOx emissions actually went up. So we have to, policymakers have to look at what the results are, what the impact this investment can be, and realize, at least in the short term, and when I say short term, I think I agree with Mike here, we're talking the next 20, 30 years, encourage this long-term growth, come up with strategies that are gonna get us to where we need to be by 2040 or 2050, but realize we have a bevy of technologies available today that can get us a lot cleaner and reduce a lot more carbon than just going all with one technology.
I'll just add to that. I think all the Californians are moving to Texas. That's why their population is going up. because of their policies. I can just tell you that. On the government, what should the government do is basically your question. We think that it should be fair to all technologies, particularly that have already gotten to commercial scale. All of these types of vehicles are using the roads. There's a growing deficit in the Highway Trust Fund. So we think these other vehicles, particularly like electric vehicles, should pay their fair share into that to help pay for infrastructure, not only for the roads and bridges, but for the electric vehicle charging station infrastructure. The utilities, we believe, should not be able to raise rates on consumers to, pass along those costs to develop those electric charging stations. And there should be more competition in the development of that type of infrastructure, not just utilities. Again, the state governments should respect the consumer choice. You look in California with the policies, in Massachusetts, we don't think they're respecting that type of choice with their push towards electric vehicles. And I agree that approach like in Texas, allowing for all these technologies to kind of mature and can be the best solution versus trying to focus it on one. That's our philosophy. We're going to be working with Congress and the new administration on, besides transportation functions, other things that can reduce carbon emissions through crop production. And our members are involved in the ethanol industry, the gas industry, propane industry too. So that's why we support all of the above approach. We think not only it makes sense economically for consumers to make sure it's affordable, but also from a national security perspective that was mentioned in the very front end of the call.
Yeah, helpful comments. And you mentioned infrastructure, and I think we could have a whole separate call on that. Not quite time to delve in that today, but just as we kind of approach the bottom of the hour here, just to probe the policy front a little bit more. There's a lot of talk in conservative and liberal circles about carbon fees and taxes. I'm just curious if your industries have taken a position on those, and would it make sense? We've also discussed here today about the government putting its thumb on the scale and picking one technology and over another, and how we're all generally supportive of an all of the above approach. Would it make sense to replace maybe some of the basket of current regulations that are in place, whether it's RFS or the NHTSA standards for carbon or others, and replace them with a kind of a fee or a tax or something of that nature to drive carbon emissions in a holistic way? And I just open that up to anyone. If you want to remain mum on that, that's fine.
I'm happy to speak to it. The first thing I just want to say is when I say, pick winners or losers, I mean, we should pick. That's not to say we should do nothing. That is to say, like, there is, Mike will tell you about the value of drop-in fuels for airlines, because, likely it's not, although I heard this morning that Airbus is going to put out a hydrogen plane now. But still, the point is that there are important places that each fuel has its best role. You've heard before about buses and over the road for natural gas. And I think we have to stop stopping everyone from getting anything, because we're up against a massive opportunity. And so we should all be working together to make sure that we're getting, in some way. So I wouldn't say like not picking winners and losers in that way. In terms of what you said, yes. I mean, look, if we're all grown-ups and we all pulled up our big people pants and we just said, okay, like, look, there's no carbon price that will help us in transportation fuel because there's not enough carbon, and, the fee will never go up to change. So it's going to have its own policy, whether it be a gas tax, or now vehicle miles traveled, or congestion pricing or something. So look, if we were all here and we all talk free markets, let's put a price on it, the externalities, and people will choose what they want, and everything will be great. But that's not the way America is working. It's not the way our country is. So we can sit here and and wait for the perfect solution and watch China, eat our lunch, because that's what's been going on for 20 years. We're all sitting here going like there's some pure market thing going on and we can't do anything. And I think the biggest change, forget Trump for a minute, is really Republicans reassessing market orthodoxy, and I'm going to use the word industrial, not planning, strategy. We've always had industrial strategy, but now we know that if you do not have a strategy, and there's a country like China out there, if they're wrong, 50 million people can die. That's true, like the Great Famine. But if they're right, and like right now we're watching a big right on many issues, we're going to get killed. And I just think like, that's amazing. Look at the semiconductor bill, look at the pharmaceutical bill, look at the, and I think batteries are part of it. And I think some of the fuels here that we're talking about are part of it. So to me, it's yes, it would be great to just have a market signal, but there's no free and fair market. So let's be honest about that and say, this is the way the United States is willing to do things, sausage making, and let's make some sausage.
The only thing I'd say about a carbon tax, if you look at OPEC, because of, again, we're now an exporter of energy because of the technology on fracking and everything else. So OPEC has tried to manipulate pricing to hurt the U.S. domestic production. I think if you just have the U.S. impose a carbon tax on our industry, it could be adversely impact the domestic industry while to the benefit of other foreign countries. And I don't think we want to go back to being dependent on Middle Eastern oil.
Right. I don't think we need to, that's the amazing thing. Like if we're just smart now, not to make ourselves, I don't want to be the group, like all of us do not want to go from the frying pan into the fire, right? Oil has now been solved, and now we have this new problem. And I just think we can make sure we don't. We just have to like, get moving here.
And I know Dave isn't on with us any longer, but he's done a good bit of work on those very issues.
Yeah, I just jumped back on. I'm locked in. I can't escape now.
Okay, well, if you want to jump in on the competitive advantages relative to the United States imposing a fee and other countries, I know you've done a good bit of work on that. It might be interesting for the audience to hear.
Well, I mean, look, on this issue, and by the way, these talking points have been around since I've been working on climate since, I guess, the early 2000s. Is that if you have some type of regulatory system that regulates carbon, it's going to drive all this innovation and this transformation of the economy, and then we'll export it all and we'll get rich. And that's, it sounded good at the time, and it looked good on paper, but that's just not the way things have worked out. I mean, Europe's a great example, right? And we're talking about China taking advantage of the trade regime. Look, I think there's going to have to be some type of merger of climate and trade policy in such a way that makes sure that we're not simply creating a job program for the Chinese and for others, right? We want to innovate. We want the technology to come from here, but then we also want to make it, right? And then we want to sell it. We don't want someone else to take the innovation and sell it back to us. So we have to do this in a smart way. On carbon taxes and fees, look, I was trying to say this earlier before I kind of got interrupted, but, look, again, we get stuck into this 1990s conversation about climate policy. And we want to think that somehow if we take a 1990s approach, then that's somehow going to answer the climate crisis. And that's not going to happen, because you have to have a set of policies that developing economies will embrace, right? And you have to drive down the cost of those low carbon technologies that allow them to be competitive in those markets. Those countries are not going to pay the green premium that we're willing to pay. So I mean, we have to be practical about all this.
Very good. Folks, we're at the top of the hour, 3 p.m. So if anyone has closing comments, then I'll open it up to the floor. I'll let you have them now. Otherwise, we're pretty close to adjourning.
I would just add at the end here, Todd, we hear time and time again that climate change is cumulative, and we know that to be true. And so, our message is the longer we wait, the harder it gets to solve. We've got technologies here that are available, that are scalable. We've got infrastructure that's already in place, and we'd like to see policies implemented that provide opportunity and parity and really a chance for all clean technologies to compete so that we can have that impact as quickly as possible. especially in those communities that need it most.
I mean, my only comment, I saw someone comment on Norway in our Q&A, and I will wholeheartedly say, look, you can walk and chew gum at the same time. Norway produces more oil than anyone, has the sovereign wealth fund that's the richest in the world, and yet they have the largest EV penetration in the world, and most of their cars are now being sold that are EVs. And once again, that's just saying you can have two solutions sets. And if I were Texas, I'd be exporting my oil to everyone else while just using electricity and natural gas to power my vehicles. So to me, we just have to have this approach now, because look, there's going to be an infrastructure bill. I hear what Mike said about energy bill, but there'll be an infrastructure bill, and there'll be a lot of infrastructure like refueling stations and retooling of these vehicles, and jobs will matter. And so once again, I think we need an alliance that looks at how you spend the money, and let's not worry about the regulatory side, and let's make it fuel neutral, because in the end, I do believe that these solutions will all have their day in the right vehicle segment.
Okay, anyone else want to jump in here?
Well, the only thing I'll mention is there are bipartisan efforts already. It started in the last Congress. If you look, there's a proposal called the Growing Climate Solutions Act. It's got Senator Braun, Senator Stabenow, Senator Graham, Senator Whitehouse. So, and it's happening also in the House of Representatives. So I think there is a recognition of trying to address some of these issues, make it more incentive-based versus kind of a mandating, heavy-handed mandates of the federal government. And I think having that kind of approach in Congress is going to move the ball forward. And again, what was mentioned here about Texas, I think is a pretty good example of what can be done federally to help the states and these industries move along.
Okay. Well, I appreciate everyone's time here today. I know we scratched the surface on a whole lot of broad and very complex issues, but I hope it's been a good conversation for our viewers and for everyone here. And it's good food for additional thought and perhaps another webinar in the series that we have going. But thanks for joining, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Bye-bye.